will follow the official speakers. I'm David Hood. For those that don't know me, I'm an adjunct professor in the Science and Engineering faculty here at QUT. I was the 2012 National President of Engineers Australia, and amongst a number of other roles, I'm also a Director of and Deputy Chairman of Beyond Zero Emissions. First, may I, in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledge the Turrbal, Yagara, Kabi Kabi and Jinibara peoples as the traditional owners of the land on which QUT now stands, and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. Tonight's event is being hosted jointly by BZE in association with the Sustainable Engineering Society of Engineers Australia. And of course I want to thank QUT for providing this excellent venue for us. I'm sorry that a couple of people are going to have to stand, because when we decided to launch the report in Brisbane, it had already been launched back in April, Stephen, I think, in Melbourne and Sydney, and we thought we probably wouldn't get too many people at a launch of something that had already been launched in Melbourne and Sydney. And so I'm a little bit embarrassed but thrilled that we had over 110 people register on the Eventbrite for this event, which is fantastic. Thank you for coming along. It's wonderful to share. This sort of turnout actually shows the enthusiasm that the community has for doing things differently and getting us, I guess, off roads and into more sustainable forms of transport, which is fantastic. I was just telling someone a story. Some of you may know that I also initiated and was the founding chairman of the Australian Green Infrastructure Council, now called the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, and we produced the world's first sustainability rating scheme for infrastructure projects, the Infrastructure Sustainability Rating Scheme, IS. I always remember when the the go-between bridge was opened here in Brisbane, and the then Lord Mayor, who shall remain nameless, came to me and said, David, I want you to use your scheme to rate the Clem 7 tunnel for me, because he put some money into founding the organisation and helped us get up and going. And I said, Lord Mayor, I don't know that that's a good idea, because I don't think it would get a high rating, unless of course you turn it into a stormwater storage device. He didn't laugh. A little bit about our host before we get into the formalities. BZE is a not-for-profit research and education organisation known for its work researching and advocating zero emissions economy for Australia. Our goal is to transform Australia out of a 19th century fossil fuel-based greenhouse gas intensive economy into a 21st century renewable energy powered clean economy, even a blue economy. And I'll just take a minute out to do a bit of blatant advertising. I've also set up a collaborative organisation in Australia called Blue Australasia. Some of you may know of Gunter Parley, who established sort of a trend, if you like, to change the economy from business as usual to a blue economy, based on regenerative business practices to regenerate natural and social capital. And I'm just going to do a bit of advertising. We're publishing for the Climate Summit, which will be held here on the 20th and 21st of September at QUT, a little newspaper. It's going to be a tabloid size called Business as Usual is Kaput. And Guy Lane, where are you, Guy? Guy's up the back. He's got a few copies. If you just want to help Guy go through it and get the wording right, I'd be thrilled, because we want to publish it. We need some money. Back page real estate is available for rent if you want to put some money into it. Please see Guy afterwards and have a talk about whether that's the right way to go. So maybe BZE will transform from green economies into a blue economy. So, as you know, green minimises negative impacts. What we're doing with the blue economy is moving to total positive regeneration across natural, social and economic wellness. The focus of tonight's HSE report, and in fact all our work at BZE, would not be possible without funding through donations. We're entirely funded from donations and people putting money in the tin. So outside you'll meet our wonderful volunteers, and they would dearly love to take some money off you so that we can continue our work. You can do that by either buying a report, and they're on sale there, $30, and there's a number of the other earlier reports also available. You can join as a member. We do have a membership base. You can become a baseload supporter by committing regularly a monthly payment, or just stick your hand in and donate some cash for us. That would be fantastic. They will assist you, I can assist you, or our CEO, Stephen Bygrave, who I'll introduce formally later, can also help. The other host is the Sustainable Engineering Society. It's a technical society of engineers Australia. Membership is open to anyone who has a passion for sustainability and environmental engineering. We have lawyers, scientists, a whole range of professions and others involved in the Sustainable Engineering Society. The beauty about it is that it brings to Engineers Australia a community and industry-based input to our policy making, which is fantastic. And the whole technical society, there's 35 technical societies of Engineers Australia, and they help. Sandy is here. Where are you, Sandy? Sandy, up the back there, is the chairperson of the Queensland chapter of the society. So you can talk to Sandy if you want to join the society. She'd love to see you. She's got some membership forms as well. One of the things that the society has pushed strongly is engineering education, and I know that Doug, who I'll introduce in a minute, Doug Hargraves, is passionate about engineering education. And through the society and one of our members, we've worked very hard to produce a fantastic series of books called Engie Bear. Engie Bear's Dream has already been published, and this is the latest one. Here is a copy just off the press called Engie Bear's Bridge. The former one will be a hard copy, this is a soft copy. But Engie Bear's Bridge introduces for the first time the Mayor of Managong City, who is a female panda. We need more women engineers. Housekeeping, toilets are outside. If you go out the way you came in and around the corner, they're just in there, or afterwards the door at the side here in the back will be open and it's just outside there. If you hear the bad siren go off, in the unlikely event that there's an emergency, please stay put. Don't go rushing out until you hear the next dangerous siren, which says this is real, get out of the building. Then please take the stairs down and outside, and we'll assemble that side of the building, I think. Or Doug, is it that side? That side of the building up there, yeah. Okay, now to tonight's program. In a minute I'll introduce Professor Doug Hargraves, who will welcome you on behalf of the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering. I'll then introduce Senator Larissa Waters, who will give our keynote address and formally launch the BZE's high-speed rail report. The Senator will be followed by Dr. Stephen Bygrave, who is our CEO, and who will talk in more detail about the guts of the report. We'll then have a panel of experts who will each be invited to make a very short comment either on the report itself or on sustainable transport generally, and then I'll invite questions and discussion from you all. Following our Q&A session, I invite you to stay and join us for drinks and nibbles in the room and outside and in here. We don't normally do this, as our CEO reminded me when I asked him for some money. And so the volunteers here have all put in some money to buy the drinks and the nibbles for you. So there will be a jar next to them, and if you want to help us pay for that, please tip in a little extra money to pay for the drinkies and help us along. So let's get underway. I'll now introduce Professor Doug Hargraves. Doug was the 2010 National President of Engineers Australia. Doug has held many positions here at QUT. He was head of the School of Mechanical Engineering, and currently Doug is head of the School of Engineering Systems here at QUT. He's a mechanical engineer, having published over 100 referee papers on tribology. Tribology, as you know, is friction, wear, lubrication, and all those things. A very essential study or discipline, if you like, for high-speed rail, because we have to reduce the energy that's needed to push and circle and get things moving on steel to steel. Doug's also passionate about engineering education and has written in excess of 30 papers in that field. He's been very active in Engineers Australia over his career, contributed extensively to the Australasian Association of Engineering Education. He served on a number of our committees. He was on the board of the College of Mechanical Engineers. He's been on National Congress. And of course, he's been on our board of directors, or council as we still call it, soon to be board of directors, where he became national president. Since becoming the head of school, he's developed and implemented a model of leadership that's referred to as values-driven leadership, and is the current Vice Chancellor's champion for science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Doug was admitted as a member of the Order of Australia in this year's Queen's Birthday Honours List. Would you please welcome Professor Doug Hargraves.
Thank you, David. It's rather daunting when people read out your CVs and so forth. Well, that makes me very humble and somewhat embarrassed. But all I want to do here right now is to welcome everyone here to this venue, to this launch of this very important report. But I also want to apologise for our Executive Dean, Professor Gordon Wyeth, who could not be here tonight, and also Professor John Bell, who wanted to be here tonight but both had other venues that they had to go to. So I'd just like to apologise for both of them. So again, what I'm here for is just to welcome you, to say that I hope you get a lot out of tonight. I hope you really enjoy the presentations, but also I hope you've got lots of questions available for the other panellists, not me. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Doug will join us on the panel a little bit later. Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce and invite Senator Larissa Waters to give our keynote address tonight. Senator Waters, as you well know, is the Senator for Queensland, and she's a hero of our planet. She may be a politician, but she stands out amongst a pretty unimaginative and often uninspiring bunch that we send to Canberra down there in Parliament House. Her championing of environment and sustainability issues makes her a hero of mine, and I'm sure of many other people. Larissa holds a science and law degrees and was elected to the Senate in 2010, taking up her seat on the 1st of July 2011. I could talk on for hours about Larissa and all the things that she does, but that's enough. Please welcome Senator Larissa Waters.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I feel very embarrassed, much as you did, so I'm in good company. It's lovely to see a full room tonight, despite the fact that this is a relaunch. I think it's a testament to the interest that Brisbaneites have in a sustainable future and in sustainable transport in particular. So well done to all of you for sharing your evening to be inspired by some wonderful academic research that is both practical and visionary. Another fantastic report delivered by BZE. And of course, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm going to out myself as a massive BZE supporter and I think a donor as well. I'm not sure what category I fall into, but yes, just in case you hadn't been aware, I'm in full support of BZE and the awesome work that you do. So thanks again for inviting me along tonight. It's a great privilege to be able to be involved in launching the report. And again, I share my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight. And hello to all the folks that I know in the audience. It's nice to see some familiar faces and a few new ones too. Look, high-speed rail is well and truly an idea whose time has come. And in fact, I think it's been, 50 years now since Japan had their bullet train. So one might say it's an idea whose time came 50 years ago, so it's about time we got on board. It's the perfect example of the sort of sustainable nation building that I think the Australian government should be investing in. We hear a lot of talk about nation building and we hear a lot of talk about infrastructure investment. Why aren't we hearing a bit more talk about high-speed rail? Is my reaction to that. We have a Prime Minister who I have very strong views about that I'm looking forward to taking any questions on later on, but who has held himself out to be an infrastructure Prime Minister. And yet, in the recent budget, the funding for the High Speed Rail Authority was junked, ceased, evaporated. What I'll do tonight in a brief speech that I'll give before we hear from the real keynote speaker, who actually knows all of the wonderful detail about this, Dr. Bygrave, is just do a little history of what's happened in the parliamentary sphere on high speed rail in the last few years. So I'll come back to that point about what we can do about our current Prime Minister and some developments this morning actually. And I mean that in the nicest possible way to the Prime Minister. Look, high speed rail, what is most exciting to me about this is that it's a potential for carbon neutral travel. Now in this day and age where we're all terribly mobile and our jobs require us to be so, our social lives often allow us to be so, but as people who are climate conscious, I want to be able to go to Parliament as often as I do sustainably. And so I guess I read this particular report with that personal interest in mind, perhaps in the hope or perhaps the dread that I might still be in Parliament by 2030 when this would be, or 2025 when this would be up and running. But be that as it may, It's clear that we are travelling an awful lot more these days, and in fact the Melbourne to Sydney route is now the 5th busiest air travel route. So the need for sustainable alternatives is evident. And that's my favourite feature of this particular report tonight, is that the high-speed rail East Coast system could be powered by 100% renewables. I know I've got a question for later on in terms of what's the payback period, not on the cost, which most politicians tend to be focused on, but what's the payback period on carbon? I think you've mentioned that in your report, so I'll look forward to your response on that one. So pollution-free travel. What's also exciting is the convenience of rail travel. You don't have to switch your phone off, which is in one sense a blessing, and in another a massive curse for those of us who are permanently attached to our devices doing work of some description. So the convenience is a real feature of it, and the fact that it would depart from the CBD rather than the hike out to the airport is again really attractive for particularly business passengers and for tourists as well. The other excellent features are, of course, that it's a massive stimulus. It's a boost to manufacturing, it's a boost to construction, it's a boost to jobs. There's basically no downsides to this proposal. So let's hope that the utter logic of the proposals gets through to the powers that be at the current time. In terms of the history of this proposal, it's been bubbling around globally for ages, and sadly it's only Australia and Antarctica that don't currently have a high-speed rail project on foot. And I'm going to shamelessly steal Adam Vant's excellent quip, which is the penguins can't beat us to it. So I'll credit him with the giggles tonight. But back in 2010, when the Greens had the opportunity to support the Labor government to form government, we reached an agreement with the Labor Party and said, well, we'll support you to form government if you can deliver on a whole range of things. One of those was universal dental care, which is exciting. My favourite was, of course, the carbon price, VAIL, the carbon price, which we just lost a month ago, but we will get back stronger and better. But the third key one was a feasibility study into high-speed rail on the East Coast. And we secured agreement for a $20 million feasibility study, so a decent chunky study that took a few years to roll out. The first tranche came through about a year later in August 2011, which was a preliminary report. The more detailed report was released in August 2013 from memory, and it was a really exciting report. It basically said, yes, high-speed rail is feasible. Yes, it'll be a little bit costly up front, but it will pay itself back very rapidly, and it will have all sorts of these economic stimulus benefits, as well as, of course, climate and environment benefits. So that was a really exciting and optimistic report. I think that the costing that it delivered was $114 billion, which is a large infrastructure spend, but if that spend can pay itself off, it can have all of these other social and environmental dividends. If it's got this great job and economic stimulus, well, it seems like a positive investment to me. I'll come back to the idea of the fact that I think these sorts of infrastructure projects are ones that governments should fund, which is a bit of a different approach to the current government. So that was the 2013 study. The Greens welcomed that, and we took to the 2013 election a policy that we would like to see that report implemented in its entirety and fast-tracked. And we put some costings to the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is an independent body that is, which was another feature of the agreement to set up that body that the Greens reached with Labor, an independent body that costed election promises, because it's very easy to make statements before an election, but it's important to be able to back those up with figures and to balance your platform. So the PBO costed our proposal, and the proposal was not for the full $114 billion, but it was for the first 4 years to say, well, let's set up an authority that can actually start the process of identifying a route, that can then talk with the state and local councils and secure ownership of that route, and can then undergo the environmental impact statement, which, as we know, can take a little while, as it should, because you need to do a decent one, not just a showy one, as so often happens. So we took that costed proposal to the election, and I still think it's an absolutely brilliant proposal. What's interesting is to see the BZE proposal, which is slightly different, and I'm keen to hear about the differences in your approach to that slightly more costly version. Perhaps it's just the approximation of time, who knows? I'm interested to see the reasons for distinction. but full support for this magnificent proposal. And what I particularly like about it is the delivery timeframe. We've got 10 years to build a visionary, future-focused, really practical infrastructure build. That's a pretty good timeframe. Now, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, so things were tracking along well. 2013, great report. Labor then came out saying we think this is a great idea too. Unfortunately, the election, of course, delivered a result of government that is now trying to bring down a budget that is extremely, in my view, cruel and brutal to those who can least afford it, and which has cut funding to that high-speed rail authority that was set up to start looking at implementing those recommendations. So we all thought that high-speed rail was on the back burner, perhaps for the entire term of this government, until this morning, when Andrew Robb, I think, has had a little bit of a chat with the Japanese and then with the Australian, and has said, well, if somebody else wants to fund it, great, we'll back it. Now, you know, hey, I'll take any improvement that I can get. That's at least better than no mention of high-speed rail at all. So it seems that at least the government is now thinking about the sorts of proposals that they might seek private investment for, and that's a welcome development. There's been some looking at Australian article. If you haven't, I know it's the Australian, but here are many other papers, so you know one has to read these things. The article cites some recent polling that finds public support for high-speed rail at 82%, which is great and which you would expect. Practical idea, it's going to be affordable, it's going to be convenient, it's going to be carbon neutral ultimately, or at least can be. So I'm really pleased that the public can see the sense of these sorts of proposals. But as I say, the focus comes on the Central Japan Railway Company, who have said that they might be able to build it cheaper than 114 billion by way of fewer tunnels. I'm not the expert in construction, but what I took from that was some excitement that at least the government is now having discussions about these sorts of proposals. It's back on their radar. And I guess my key objection is I don't think we should be reliant on private funding to build these sorts of public infrastructure in the nation. I think that providing affordable, convenient, pollution-free, or at least low-carbon transport is an obligation that governments should provide to the public. I think that's a public service. So we'll continue to advocate for that, and yeah, we'll take whatever positive indications we can and just never give up. Adam Bant, who's our transport spokesperson who makes those great jokes about penguins, put out a statement responding to that article this morning and said that next week in the Parliament we'll test this newfound interest in high-speed rail by the Abbott government by putting a motion to the Parliament calling on them to support high-speed rail and to fast-track it. We haven't written the motion yet, so I won't go into the details, but it'll be a motion effectively that says, well, if you really want to do this thing, well, let's go for it, we'll back you, let's do it, it's about time. So we'll be watching to see what happens next week with that particular motion. We don't have an excellent track record of getting support for our motions because they tend to be really good ideas, and apparently that's not the done thing in Parliament, so I'll let you know how we go in terms of how the numbers fall on that motion once we put it next week. That's really all I wanted to say. I think my time's probably getting a bit close, but you're shaking your head.
You keep going.
Well, I wanted to take the chance to congratulate BZE and to formally launch the report, which I confess I've only read the executive summary of, as is the way of busy people. I'm looking forward to hearing the detail tonight. But I just want to assure you that the Greens remain in full support of this concept. The Labor Party appears to be as well. What with the Senate the way it is, you'll need to get a few more supporters to get this off the ground. But with the government now making some noises this morning, the momentum could start to build again. So I'm positive about the future of high-speed rail. I think it's inevitable. It's just a question of when we'll get around to doing it. And against the backdrop of a budget that seems to make cuts in every area but the ones that should be cutting, like fossil fuel subsidies and massive tax breaks for big banks and big mining companies, who knows whether we'll get to it in this term of government, but it will come very soon. And work like this that shows that it can be done in a practical manner, in a very quick manner, and in a way that's even cheaper than the original government proposal a few years ago, can only serve to propel that momentum along to a fantastic outcome. So once again, well done, and it's my great pleasure to formally wave this around and launch the Brisbane leg of the High Speed Rail Zero Carbon Australia report.
There's our next female Prime Minister, I think. She might have to change parties unless we get the Greens, I think. Now, the report has been launched. It will be available. If you haven't bought your copy already, they're on sale outside. You can buy them for $30. Or you can download it free off the BZE website, which is bze.org.au. To tell us more about the detail and to go into some of the research bits and pieces, Stephen Bygrave, our CEO, didn't actually write the report, and unfortunately the authors couldn't be here tonight, but Stephen's been reading furiously and writing notes on it, and I'm sure he'll be able to go into some great detail on it. Stephen has a Bachelor of Science, First Class Honours, and a Bachelor of Economics from ANU, and he completed his PhD, again at ANU, in Resources and Environmental Management. Stephen has worked on renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, emissions trading, climate change for over 20 years. He designed Australia's mandatory renewable energy target, soon to be dismantled, in the late 1990s, as well as on Australia's Clean Energy Future Package, including developing for John Howard the first ETS that we were introduced to. Stephen is also an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales. To tell us more about the report itself, would you please welcome Dr. Stephen Bygrave.
Well, thank you, David, for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you, Larissa and Doug as well for hosting us here tonight. Really appreciate it. This is actually our third launch, but it's great to have a third launch because it actually keeps the story running. We've had great media today. We had an article in news.com.au. I was just on ABC Radio before the launch tonight, and we've been on the ABC Gold Coast tomorrow morning at 7 AM. So we're really getting some good media out of this, and the longer we can keep the story running, Channel 7 actually want to do something tomorrow as well. So it's great news, and we've launched this in Melbourne with John Alexander, the federal member for Bennelong. We launched this in Sydney as well with the CEO of the Australasian Railway Association and also the Mayor of Goulburn. And it's great to see so many mayors actually supporting this initiative too, because it's actually opening up regional areas for development, which I'll touch on a bit more. Look, I'd really like to thank all of you and future volunteers and supporters of Beyond Zero Emissions. As our Deputy Chair, David, mentioned, we are entirely independent. We get funding from philanthropic organisations and from baseload supporters. And so your donations allow us to continue the good work that we do. To assure you, we don't spend supporters and donors' money on red wine. So we would like contributions tonight for the drinks. And I'll certainly be chipping in there as well. But look, thank you to all the volunteers, all the people in blue t-shirts have made tonight happen. In particular, Brad up there in the corner, and Beck as well, and Rob in particular. We've been emailing each other frantically over the last week or so, making tonight happen, and David's been a really important part of that too, so thank you very much, David. Great to have David emceeing, because I've been emceeing for the last 2 launches, and my fellow researchers have been doing the presentation which I'm about to give. So on their behalf, so Gerard Drew and Patrick Herbst are the authors of this report. They've done the heavy lifting and the hard work behind this report. It's extremely comprehensive. When I've shown it to people, they've said this is worth $1 million. We would be paying a consulting firm $1 million to do a report like this, and we've done it on a shoestring budget. Many volunteers have also contributed to the detail of this report, and they're all listed in the front covers there. And that also goes for our stationary energy plan, which was launched some 3 or 4 years ago, and our buildings plan, which I think is probably the largest crowdsourced research project in Australia. Over 130 volunteers and supporters contribute to that project. We do seek volunteer researchers for our work. We're currently doing work on electric vehicles. We're doing work on Australia as a renewable energy superpower, and we're also just about to launch our land use report showing how we can transform our agriculture and forestry sector to be zero emissions as well. So very exciting work, and I'm very, very proud to be the CEO of this organisation. So without further ado, there are a number of reasons why high-speed rail makes sense, and I'll be going through a number of those one by one. But what I've told the media today, it's a faster, cheaper, cleaner way of travelling. It allows you, as Larissa said, to travel from city centre to city centre. As I commented on ABC Radio this afternoon, by the time you've gone from Brisbane to the airport in a taxi, gone through security, checked in, waiting around a lounge, if you're on a high-speed rail, you'll literally be halfway to Sydney. You can get to Sydney from here with high-speed rail travelling 350 kilometres an hour in less than 3 hours. Similarly, between Sydney and Melbourne, travelled by high-speed rail, less than 3 hours. And so when you factor in all of those inconveniences of air travel, let alone the greenhouse gas emissions that come with air travel, you find yourself having a much more convenient, cheaper and cleaner way of travelling. So some of those are the motivations. Obviously, Beyond Zero is motivated by the greenhouse challenge, the climate change challenge, which we know is upon us. And we risk catastrophic climate change occurring if it's not occurring already. We're seeing glaciers melting, the Antarctic ice sheets melting, more severe droughts, bushfires and floods. And the sooner we get on with addressing climate change, the better. And high-speed rail is yet another zero-emission solution that we can implement right now. As Larissa commented, Japan has had high-speed rail for 50 years. Germany's had high-speed rail for a little bit less. China's going gangbusters with high-speed rail. Australia is the only inhabited continent without high-speed rail, so let's get on with it. And I'll make that case even more clearly as we go through the presentation. So, zero emissions, the transport solution. High-speed rail is yet another one, along with electric vehicles and other solutions. It is also a sound investment. There is good reason for the private sector to fund a project like this, but also for government to put in funding to what would be a public benefit. It's a sound investment, and we will show that it will achieve full capital repayment, and we can complete it in a meaningful time frame. And throughout the presentation, I'll be referring a little bit to the previous government's study, because it's probably worth referring to some of those the points made in that study as a comparison against our own. I don't want to critique the other study in a lot of detail, but as I go through the presentation, some of the points will become clear. So I'll go through a number of issues. The first three issues I'll touch on will be the passenger demand for high-speed rail. We did a lot of detailed work on the railway corridor and the route, because obviously the route you select has a critical impact on the costs. If you have a lot of tunnelling and bridge work, you multiply the capital costs tenfold or more. For example, if you have a rail system going along relatively level ground, the average cost is around $16 million a kilometre. As soon as you introduce bridging and tunnelling, your costs become in the order of $150 to $170 million a kilometre. So that's a very important point to make. And I'll touch on some of those issues as we go. But we spend a lot of time, or the researchers spend a lot of time going through the most optimum route to minimise costs, but also allow a highly efficient and time effective way of travel. I'll also go through issues related to the level of performance of the high-speed rail service. So let's touch on demand. Last year, the previous government study estimated around 84 million passengers that would occupy the high-speed rail system when it was fully operational. Now, that doesn't mean a lot on its own. but it's much more than today's air passengers. And by experience, you all know the demand for travel. When you go to the airport, you see, you drop off your car, you park in your car, there's hordes of cars, you navigate the ocean-like car park, and then you make your way through the crowds to check in. Much time spent checking in, and then going through security, laptops, etc., and then waiting around for the plane, which can be delayed. Now, this may not be the way you need to travel. So let's look at the passenger activity in Australia. Now, this slide shows you the travel activity in Australia across the different modes. So the different colours indicate the different modes. So we've got blue for air, for example, red for rail, green for passenger car, and light green for bus. And the line thickness demonstrates the volume of traffic, or the traffic level. So you can see from this slide, there's an obvious concentration of travel in the southeast corner of Australia. Now that just happens to contain, as we know, around half of all Australian regional travel. So between Melbourne and Brisbane, that's half of all Australian regional travel. But not only that, we all know along the eastern corridor of Australia, we have around 80% of Australia's population. Incredible demand for travel, and let's put this travel activity into a bit more context. So as I mentioned, the thickness of those lines demonstrate or reflect the volume of traffic. Now these air routes are some of the busiest in the world. When I was interviewed by news.com, they said, well, you know, there's not much population in Australia, why would we have high-speed rail? And I said to them, well, it's the passenger demand that's important. As Larissa pointed out, Sydney-Melbourne is the fifth busiest air route in the world. The fifth busiest. It compares to Beijing and Shanghai, with populations of 25 million people. It's the busiest air route in the world that goes over land. So the other four busiest air routes actually go over waterways, which are much harder, obviously, to drive a car through. So this is an obvious case for high-speed rail in the eastern corridor. Brisbane to Sydney, 13th busiest air route in the world. So this is a special case which calls for special treatment. Now, before I continue, let me ask for a show of hands. Who would choose a 3-hour train journey to Sydney over the 90-minute flight we're accustomed to? Well, there you go. Is this an underestimation? I think so. Of course, the full answer is unknown, but let's look at the international experience. So I'll explain this chart in a little bit more detail. What this shows is the proportion of people who choose high-speed rail over air travel in relation to the train journey time. So we've got time along the y-axis, and on the x-axis we've got the percentage of passengers who would travel with rail. So as train travel time increases, more passengers choose air travel, and vice versa. So in various countries and cultures, a strong trend has been observed. This includes the Eurostar between London and Paris and Brussels, and the Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka, amongst others. Now, what this trend indicates is that for a train journey of around 3 hours, for example, Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, lo and behold, you would expect a 60 to 70% share of today's busy travel market. And lo and behold, this is what both our research and the government study, the previous Labor government studies conclude. So you can see here, Sydney-Canberra, high-speed rail travel in vehicle times about 1 hour. And so you'd expect about 90% of passengers wanting to travel on rail as opposed to air. And similarly, Brisbane-Canberra, just under 4 hours, you'd expect around half of the population to want to travel by rail as opposed to air. And you can see all of the other major routes in Australia along the Eastern Corridor, Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, would be at least 50% of passengers that would travel by rail as opposed to air. And that's for the very reasons that Larissa and I pointed out earlier, is that it's more convenient for travel times of between 1 and 6 hours. This is borne out in Europe as well. And it's particularly relevant between distances of travel between, say, 250, 300 kilometres an hour, 300 kilometres and around 1,200 kilometres. Because it's those distances where you don't want to hop in your car, and you don't necessarily want to hop in a plane. You want to hop on a train. So, as I mentioned earlier, the researchers Gerard and Patrick and a whole host of volunteers did a lot of work also on the alignment, the rail path for the high-speed rail system. Now, this is critical work, and with hours and hours and hours of modelling, topographic maps, etc., to determine the best route. Now, on the screen, you'll see the rail pathway selected by the investigation. It includes stations in 6 major cities and 12 regional towns. And as I said before, this alignment connects 60% of Australia's population. 60% of Australia's population would live within 50 kilometres of the high-speed rail system. So we looked in detail at the rail path, and this required a lot of factors to consider. We considered the towns and the population centres. We considered the travel activity. We considered the land features, the water bodies, the environmentally sensitive areas, other infrastructure and urban boundaries. And some of the more challenging areas were around Sydney, where you have some topographic challenges, crossing the Hawkesbury River, for example. But there are many other challenges along the route as well. Now, what's interesting is that the route that the researchers selected is actually not that much different to the alignment that the previous government study also came up with. So our alignment is in brown there, or orange, and the previous government study is in blue. And you can see the very, very, very little difference. And so we don't think this is an issue of contention. It actually confirms, we did our analysis independently, and actually confirms that the routes are actually very, very similar, and really just a few locations where we zigged and they zagged. Interestingly, one of the most notable differences was around southeast Queensland, in the vicinity of the Gold Coast, where the previous government study chose to go west of Mount Mooring, a rather large volcanic crater, and the BZE researchers thought that it was better to go east of Mount Mooring and pick up the Gold Coast traffic, and with 2 stops in southeast Queensland and Morang. So I guess either case is workable with pros and cons, but I guess what this is showing is that such similar results from 2 separate investigations gives you a really high degree of confidence in reserving a corridor for this infrastructure. And reserving a corridor is one of the critical first steps, because you need the land, you need to secure the land, and I know Anthony Albanese, the previous Transport Minister, has been working feverishly on this issue. And I understand Warren Truss has also written to his state territory counterparts to also work towards securing the land. Because once you secure the land, you can then secure the financing to get on and build high-speed rail. Let me now turn to the performance and experience of high-speed rail. And this is a really important issue. It's some of the qualitative factors as well as the quantitative factors that are really important for high-speed rail. In fact, the ABC journo that interviewed me just before tonight's launch says that she's in a wheelchair. And she said, how would high-speed rail account for people travelling in wheelchairs? And I said, well, it would be much more conducive than the 2 seats that are currently reserved for wheelchair passengers in aircraft. So we all know, travelling on trains and trams, that there are reserved areas for wheelchairs in every carriage. And we would imagine being able to do that, it makes obvious sense to do that in carriages on a high-speed rail system. Much harder to do it by road. But some of the qualitative aspects are the ones I mentioned before. Just imagine this is Southern Cross Station. If you hadn't noticed there, you can see the sign, the high-speed rail sign in orange. For those of you who picked that up? Oh, good. Superimposed. So we've actually started doing this in Melbourne. We've actually started building in Melbourne. But look, just imagine you're rocking up to Southern Cross Station or Roma Street Station, and you look at your watch and you know, oh, well, I don't wear a watch, but you look at your phone and you go, oh, the next train's in 15 minutes. I'm just going to go and grab a cup of coffee, get the newspaper or read the newspaper on your iPad if you don't want to buy newsprint. And then, without a booking at all, you step on the train as the doors open within seconds of the scheduled time, and then, or you might finish your coffee and get the next train 15 minutes later. You'll see in this report, the researchers in the very opening page put together the schedule. And this is, it's obviously a bit of a forward-looking, futuristic schedule, but it gives you an idea of the times, the frequency, and the convenience of travelling on such a system as high-speed rail. So, performance experience, so many benefits that go beyond the quantitative aspects. I'm now going to touch on the final three elements to this report. Fourthly, the fourth point is around the emission reductions, and obviously this is a very important issue for beyond zero emissions, and I heard from Larissa as well, obviously greenhouse gas reductions, and this being a zero emissions transport solution is a critical point. I'll also touch on the construction costs, because they're obviously important, and the commercial performance of this high-speed rail system. And in fact, you'll see that we actually have quite an impressive commercial performance, which we think is a real game changer for the arguments for high-speed rail. So, emissions. You can even see them coming out of the back of this plane. Unlike air and car transport, high-speed rail is not dependent on fossil fuels. High-speed rail is electrified, and like the rest of our electrified infrastructure, can be readily powered by renewable energy, which is available right here, right now. We've shown this 4 years ago when we launched our stationary energy plan, that we can build right now with existing technology a electricity grid in Australia based on 100% renewable energy. A mix of concentrated solar thermal, wind, solar, biomass, other technologies which are off the shelf. We don't need to wait for any breakthroughs in technology. That means if you've got a grid based on 100% renewable energy, it means you can have a high-speed rail system which is a zero emission solution. Now, car travel is already heading this way with electric and fuel cell platforms, but there is no emissions-free solution to air travel on the horizon. Even biofuels significantly add to global warming when combustion emissions are factored in, and particularly at atmosphere at cruise altitude. So these emissions are still produced. And as I said, by having a grid with 100% renewable energy means you can have electric vehicles, you can have high-speed rail, you can have a whole range of transport infrastructure based on zero emissions. And that's the really important point behind this report. And it means that we can get some real emission reductions with the shifts that we can see by shifting people away from air travel into rail travel, and tapping into the convenience factors I pointed to earlier. We can really reduce emissions in this country. Over 150 million tonnes, in fact, as we've pointed out in this report. And Larissa, you asked me for the payback. There's a 5-year payback, because there's emissions associated with build of the high-speed rail system, and those emissions would be paid back in a 5-year period. So we have fully electrified rail systems are all over the world. The European system is electrified, although the French system is fully electrified, unfortunately it runs off mostly nuclear energy, which beyond zero emissions does not support. So this is a TGV in France, but by building high-speed rail, the 150 million tonnes of greenhouse gas reductions, this is also 30% of emissions from regional travel in the southeast corridor. Now, there are obviously other emissions with bus travel and car travel, which we are addressing in future reports. And as I said before, we're currently pursuing an electric vehicles report, which we're hoping to launch by the end of this calendar year as well. So construction on cost. Construction and cost. Let's make no mistake, transport infrastructure is expensive. So you'll hear a few zeros when I talk about cost. So the previous government study estimated that you could build a high-speed rail system for around $114 billion. The work that we've done shows that we can do that for $30 billion less. Now, although the routes are very, very similar, as on a previous slide, the solution we've come up with has less tunnelling and less building, as I said, and less building of bridges. So that means that you can have quite a big reduction in overall capital costs. And a lot of attention went into this because we're aware that not only are we providing a vision for technical solutions for Australia and hopefully for the world in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to make sure it's economically feasible, which this is. So we went into all the different costs associated with building high-speed rail. You can see a lot of the costs listed on the right-hand side there. And the result, as I mentioned, was $84 billion worth of construction, management and equipment. And there's also a 15% contingency built in there as well. Now that is a lot of money, but it is 25% lower than the previous government's estimate. And let me also put the $84 billion another way. We currently spend $18 billion a year on roads. $18 billion a year on roads. So $84 billion is actually 5 years of road expenditure. Or to put it another way, it's 7 years of domestic airfares. Or to put it another way, it's only 3 years of road expenditure and domestic airfares. So it is expensive, let's not shy away from that. But relatively speaking, it's efficient and it is cost effective. So where will the money come from? We've done a lot of work on this as well. As I mentioned before, and Larissa's touched on it too, there are a range of firms who are ready and available to build and invest in this technology and in this system. In Australia we have firms representing the Spanish, the Germans, the Chinese, the Japanese. They all have offices in Australia and they're all waiting for the signal. Now, we've also done a lot of work on revenue, and the revenue potential of competitive fares of high-speed rail as compared to air fares is a real game changer for the high-speed rail system. So, with an adequate return on investment, private equity funds could contribute significant capital to fund a more rapid construction. And at our Sydney launch, we actually had the CEO of Pottinger, a financial investment firm, and they've said that this is the type of investment that the investment community looks for. With the cooling off of the mining boom, there's a downturn in investment in infrastructure, and it's actually the right time to think about investing relatively safe investments such as high-speed rail. So let's look a little bit at the fare assumptions and what high-speed rail is assumed to compete with. So this slide shows you a sample of all flights from Sydney to Melbourne over one day, and each dot is the cheapest ticket available for each flight. And the average daily ticket price, weighted by the load factor, is indicated by the black line. So the high-speed rail fare should be priced slightly below this level to be competitive. Now let's just look at what the previous government study assumed in terms of fare analysis. They actually assumed that that's the competitive airfare that high-speed rail will compete against. That's actually the budget airline airfare, and obviously it's not a realistic assumption around what high-speed rail will be comparing. So this is competing with this is what the previous government study looked at. They compared with the Jetstar sale fare, the Jetstar sale fare, and they also assumed that this would remain unchanged for the next 70 years. Now, this has a very big impact on the uptake of high-speed rail, and therefore the revenue potential that one would be able to accrue from this investment. So by having a more competitive high-speed rail airfare against a more realistic airfare means that you will get much more take-up of high-speed rail, therefore more revenue, and therefore this slide shows you in fact the cash flow and the commercial return. So this additional profit makes a very big difference and allows full capital recovery in 40 years. And so the investment can be repaid by users over time from the fare revenue, and therefore not only will high-speed rail be a pleasure to see, but also a commercial success. And we believe this analysis is a real game changer. We've been pleasantly surprised at the feedback we've had from this analysis when we presented it to other audiences. So, to conclude, these findings, both the environmental, the greenhouse gas, the commercial aspects, the cash flow analysis, the route selected, make high-speed rail a real prospect for Australia right now. There's no need to delay. This will transform Australia. It's, as Larissa said, a nation-building activity. It will transform not only how we move around, but also how we think about our country. We'll be more connected, more equitable, and more sustainable. High-speed rail is a real solution to reversing the rising tide of our transport emissions. The demand is here, as we've seen. Sydney-Melbourne, 5th busiest air route. Sydney-Brisbane, 13th busiest air route in the world. The returns are significant, and by drawing attention to these results, we can accelerate the delivery of this important infrastructure. So from here, don't walk away and think there's nothing you can do. Please walk away and think there's lots that you can do, because there is lots. You can read the report, and reading the executive summary is a great start for those of us who are time poor. But you can also encourage others to read it. You can spread the message, spread the word to as many people as you can. We're hoping to spend a lot of time going to the various towns along the route. The mayors are very supportive, as I mentioned before, of this project. The community is also very supportive. We want to spend time in those communities, talking to them, building community momentum and political pressure for this to be built. Because they will then speak to their local MPs, the local MPs will speak to their ministers, and there will be real pressure. Larissa knows how the political system works. I've worked in government as a public servant for a few years. I kind of know how the system works too, and it's really what politicians respond to is community pressure, community will. So let's all make this a reality. Thanks very much for your time.
is doable. We've just got to do it. Something that my early career was in aviation, and something that people don't realise is the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere in making aluminium. Can anyone tell me how much CO2 goes into the atmosphere for 1 tonne of aluminium? Manufacture of new aluminium. Between about 26 and 32 tonnes. It's coming down, of course, as they get more efficient. But that's before the bugger even flies, and there's 94 tonnes of aluminium in a 747, the one that Stephen showed. Let's get into our panel. If I can now ask Stephen and Larissa and Doug to come up and take a chair up here, and I'll introduce 2 additional people for our panel. First from EA's Transport panel, Gerard Reardon, and from the Railway Technological Society of Australia, Barry Renaud. Of course, I don't need to introduce Larissa, Doug or Stephen again, but let me tell you a little bit about both Barry and Gerard. First, Barry. Barry Renaud, just... Barry has worked in rail since completing his civil engineering degree in Toowoomba, I believe. A very diverse career with QR over 35 years, working throughout Queensland, including as a project director for many major rail developments in Queensland and on contract works both interstate and overseas. Barry left QR in late 2010, joining Leighton Contractors to successfully lead the establishment of LS Rail, a new joint venture between Leighton Contractors and Australian-based company Switelski to offer advanced mechanised maintenance rail services to the Australian market. In 2013, Barry established his own rail consulting company, and I love this, BAS Rail Services. BAS Rail Services offers the rail market, an in-depth understanding of integrated rail engineering solutions, applying both his knowledge and understanding to support the commercial and operational requirements to deliver a total rail solution. Barry is here representing the Railway Technological Society of Australia, which is a joint technical society of Engineers Australia and the Institution of Professional Engineers New Zealand. Next, let me introduce Gerard Reardon. Gerard has over 25 years of experience in transportation planning, traffic engineering, road and highway design and urban development within the both public and private sectors. Prior to joining MR Cagney, Gerard held senior positions with both Brisbane City Council and Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads. While working with BCC, mainly on roads, Gerard was involved in providing high-level advice on Brisbane's light rail proposals, both South Bank master plans and on our busway network. Since joining MR Cagney, Gerard has been involved in many high-profile planning and transport projects throughout Queensland. Over the past decade, Gerard has completed numerous impact assessments, both covering a wide range of developments. And recently, for Queensland Government, Gerard oversaw the independent peer review of the patronage demand for the Gold Coast Light Rail project. Gerard has been responsible for preparation of many traffic management plans for major events and major construction projects, as well as managing the planning and detailed design of road transport projects and urban development projects. Gerard is here representing Engineers Australia's Queensland Transport panel. So I'm going to ask each of you, starting with Gerard and Barry, to give a 3-minute, no more, very tight, concise, succinct response either to the high-speed rail report or on sustainable transport generally. And then I'll ask Larissa, Doug also to make a quick comment, and then we'll open it for questions and discussion generally. So let's start with Gerard. 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you, David. Thank you for being here. As I was listening to tonight and as I read the report over the last week, a few comments came to mind about strategic directions I'd like to sort of canvass. In the context of the Institute of Engineers wants to encourage debate, we welcome the report because what this country needs is a lot of debate. We're certainly very good at designing, we're certainly very good at building, we're not too good at planning our transport infrastructure. We've got some good examples around just outside our door here of infrastructure that's been built that hasn't been too profitable at achieving any of its goals. But let's put it in a strategic context. First of all, we know that fuel cost continues to rise. We won't run out of fuel quickly, but it will never cost as low as it has been at the moment. It will continue to rise. National productivity is on the decline. Now, the economists say we have to reduce our transaction costs. That means we have to have less cost between sort of doing business together. Worldwide, 18-year-old and 24-year-olds are not buying cars. You talk to all the car sales guys, they cannot sell the cars, they personalise them. In other words, the youth, the Gen Ys have figured out, they've done the number crunching, they don't really need cars to actually have mobility. That's very interesting because that sends the direction. In the US, rail travel is actually higher than it was pre-World War II. I've had the opportunity when I was in the US to travel up from Washington through to New York, Boston. I chose rail. And as our speakers have said before, it's far more convenient. Why is it more convenient? There's less security, I can use my internet, I can actually sit on the board. And also in New York, I came up, I was in Madison Square Garden, I was right in the middle of town. So that was very attractive. The other side effect I saw of that was when I was going along that corridor, which is a similar sort of distance that we're talking about, we pulled up in the middle of nowhere. I thought it was nowhere, but there was this huge car park. And I asked the conductor what this is all about. He said, well, a lot of people actually commute into New York, park there, and then commute. So you actually get intangible benefits that are coming from that. Perhaps that didn't be picked up in what we're talking about in this concept. We also know from the World Health Organization that when you have to travel an hour one way and an hour the other way, 2 hours a day, 10 hours a week, to get to work or to get to a place of education, that is a health issue. Okay? It's not sustainable. So we also know that as Australians, we're world class at urban sprawl. Again, that is not sustainable. We also know that we're very good at producing reports on road infrastructure where we focus on the peak of the peak. So that's about the AM and morning peak. That's 1,000 hours a year, about 10 to 11% of the year to justify our expansion of our road network. And again, that is unsustainable. We do know, and a simple example is the City Cats out here, which I was lucky to be involved in. You produce and provide a high quality, fast, or frequent public transport service. It will be used. Patronage before public transport, ferries coming in is around 600,000. It's well over 4 billion now, and we've got a strategy to sort of expand it even further. So what that tells me in a strategic sense is to say that it reminds me of what the Irish poet Lee Mumford said, trend is not destiny. And so we need to stop thinking about applying our trends and where we're going. It also reminds me of another comment that someone once told me that addressing congestion by building increased capacity is like loosening the belt to address obesity. When I look at the project specifically and I read the report, one thing that it draws out to me straight away is it's connecting 12 regional cities and 6 capital cities. The key point of this is not so much the actual technology, but what it's doing for our land use. So when we look at the fact that when Larissa, you talk about potential investment, I'd be looking at what is the potential land uplift capture along that corridor. What does that mean in terms of population and where we're living? Yes, there's 80%, I think, in this corridor. So what does that mean for the future and where does that help us? So we start to have a look. The market segmentation for this type of technology is 300 to 1,300 kilometres. You read the report, it's very good. And it's well presented report, a lot of graphs, which is good. It's not new technology, it's half a decade old. Many of us probably would have been born and we're still running around when this technology was invented. It's very mature. So the question we've really got to ask ourselves at a national level is, what do we want our national infrastructure, transport infrastructure, to achieve for us? So when you look at it from a land use point of view, you get the cost recovery returns. It does have a lot of benefits, but I'd just like to contextualise this whole discussion. Technology's there, it is mature. What do we want from a land use perspective? I'd just like to leave it at that point.
Thanks, Ray.
As my resume said, I've been in the rail industry for some 37, 38 years. Through even the university's been renamed since I started as DDIE in the University of Southern Queensland. My congratulations to the author. I've also read this report, the whole 180 pages in the last few days since being volunteered to come here. And it's a very easy read for a rail interpreter. Very appropriately, while I've grown up in rail infrastructure, it focuses on the business need, the returns, what's the customer get out of it? Because unless a customer can get something out of a railway, you don't need a railway. The technology, I've travelled on the high-speed rails in China at 330 kilometres an hour. Recently in Europe, from Lyon up to Paris, sitting there with a glass of wine. The wine is more steady than the train to 20 Grove coming in tonight. but it's just a high speed, highly frequent. You sit there, you get off refreshed, you can get up and walk around, there's no seat belts, you can use all your technology, which is good or bad, particularly when you're in Europe paying Australian rates. It's there. But I also, a bit older than this, I actually go back when I was in Canberra in 1990 when the VFT project was around, I think being funded by BHP, and back then it was a 3-hour goal, the technology was there. But land speed record for rail, those TGV, just the French did it just for the fun of it, fairly recently was 574.8 kilometres per hour. They tweaked it up and got all the passengers off for insurance purposes. And in 1990, the land speed record the French did then was 503 kilometres an hour. So these trains have been in business for a long time. The technology works. I know when you read the report, this is leading edge technology. It works in a rail infrastructure activity and it costs some money to build. The good news is it's whether the community wants to run this as a land transport. Intriguingly, there's one final comment. 1865 is nearly 150 years ago. That's when QR Limited was born. Rail was used to open up land use and country. It obviously got consumed by cars weren't invented, planes were still a dream. We got this to me is high speed rail as a chance to get back to those communities connect. What better than to pour out of some Corporate Stadium or a stadium in New South Wales, or Queensland Kings in New South Wales, but get on the plane, on the train drunk and get home in Brisbane 3 hours later and go to work the next day.
Thanks, Barry. Doug, do you want to make a quick comment on the report or land transport?
Just very quickly, I just want to touch a little bit on the broader part of transport. We all know that transport itself is a high deliverer of emissions to our greenhouse gases. So therefore it's not unreasonable that we look very carefully at transport generally. And David Hood here was part of a group in 1999, part of Engineers Australia, who wrote a report on sustainable transport. And in that report it says, and I quote, "We need more investment in infrastructure that offers to develop a transport system that is integrated, more sustainable and less greenhouse gas intensive." How good was that at that time? If you have a look at some reports which go on from there, you see the same story over and over again. So I'm not going to go and refer to those reports. But we've already heard that the Japanese Shinkansen is 50 years old and the ones across the world are a little bit younger than that. And where are we? It's time. And Larissa said that before, it is time now. I think the question that we all have to answer is just how we're going to make that happen, and I think we've heard some examples of that tonight from Larissa. And we'd need a lot of help from her to actually put that into practice, whether we've got Warren Trust, for example, getting the land, acquiring the land, for example, is obviously a very good step in that process. David said that I'm a lecturer here at QUT. I lecture to just over 1,000 first-year engineering students, and I'm very, very focused on sustainable development. And one of the things which I do in that is I actually take 6 students each year to Europe and to China, Japan. And this year we're heading off to Scandinavia. And I make sure that we travel on one of these fast trains. Because our young people, unless they have the ability and the opportunity to travel themselves, will never experience that. The very first trip I took 6 students to Germany, to Italy, and I made sure we travelled on a high-speed train. And the LED up at the end of the corridor was coming up 295, 296, all the cameras were all ready. and then it all, as we got down to 291, back up to 300 and all the cameras went off. So, and I've done the same thing with last year when we went into Shinkansen outside of Tokyo. So it's an experience which I want our younger people to have, and to therefore to build their confidence and build their opportunity to make all of this happen. I think this can happen. Not sure this can happen in my own lifetime, but I hope it does. So it's time. Now's the time.
Thanks, Doug. I'd forgotten about that report back in the in the late 90s. Yeah. I've travelled on the maglev in Japan, and I got the camera out and did the same thing as we went up to 450, 452, 454 kilometres an hour. It's wonderful. Unfortunately, it's only about 80 kilometres a track. I also travelled on the TGV, I agree, your champagne, it's an absolute doesn't even ripple off the top. Larissa, would you like to add anything on the report, having now heard Stephen?
Oh,
Or
look, I'm
just-
probably
Great.
make a few things, but let's get to questions.
Okay, now for this discussion session, question and answers, can you please keep your comments short and succinct if you want to make a comment. I know lots of people have ideas and thoughts about this, but please don't get up and take over the whole show. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, would you please give your name, and if you like, you can add your affiliation, be it AECOM or anyone else. So let's get underway with questions. Blake.
Blake from Tech Eng Exec. My question's about safety. I'm sure that there's, in my own mind, I think that rail travel is much safer than road transport. And when you look at the air side of things, if you look at the big jets, you know, Australia's got a proud history of safety, but when you look at general aviation, which is especially important for some of these regional areas, I guess I'm answering the question here is that I'm thinking it's going to be safer. Can you actually explain if that is true? Because I know that could be an easy target. I know with Gold Coast Light Rail, it's a wonderful system, but people are saying, oh, hang on, you're going to have all these people getting hit by trains or these light trains. So is there some comments on safety in the report?
Yeah, do we have a roving mic or?
No.
Maybe I'll speak in the mic so we can. Yeah. Really good question, and I've been asked it before. And generally, as you say, Australia has a very good record of air travel and a very good safety record. That's not the case in other countries. And generally, rail is safer. That's not to say that rail does not have accidents. I noticed in today's paper, I think, or yesterday's paper, there was a massive train crash in the US where two freight trains actually collided on the same track. Luckily, it was a freight train. Two freight trains, so I think that there were two fatalities, and so you know rail is not accident-free. Accidents do occur, but look, I'm conscious that Barry, having 30 years history in the rail industry, will also be able to answer this question. But as far as I'm aware, rail is safer than air travel. Barry, do you want to?
The safety in rail, in well-maintained rails, is first rate, and the railways I've seen overseas. By the very nature of the speed of these tracks, they are specific to this service. You can't intermix a 100km/h freight train with a 350km/h passenger train. They're in conflict. As you read the report, it's all great. So level crossings, there's something like 9,000 level crossings in Australia, 3,000 in Queensland. Obviously that is gone from this solution. The other thing the railway does by its sheer terrain and tunnels and corridors and bridges, it is great separated. It's not at the same level as a lot of the slower railways. Fully advanced. The other thing is the sheer frequency of the trains coming also provides its own security, that one train's looking out for the next train. But the integrity of the signalling system is ETCS level 2, I think it is. I mean, that's European standard where Australia one day will get to this level of service. It's mandatory, and that's what the report's covered. So there's all those, the high-speed rail safety record is first class across that. The one which is probably fairly recent is the one in Spain, where they slowed down through a train and come off. There was a video where it's on its side. I think that was about, these trains are actually got, you know, the pilot, the train driver is not there. The train is slowing itself. It knows what's coming 10 kilometres away. This is Formula 1 on steroids. But in that section I understood they may have saved some dollars by not putting that system in the train driver. I understand, I'm not certain of that. So you can't shrink safety risk. This is airline safety standards. It is achievable in rail, and the focus on maintenance of the rolling stock, corridor, and everything you do has got to be first rate. But the Australian rail industry is up to that and does that very well in all of its major commercial railroads.
I just hope that those trains that crashed, Stephen, were not carrying tar sands oil or nuclear waste or something else, because that could have toxics here. Next question. Yeah.
Looks like that. Just a question about the connectedness in the inner city areas. So if you're going right into town, obviously it's slowing down and you've got tunnels and so on, but are any of them above ground? And is there going to be like any sort of counter transfer and so And just a comment, in the UK on their trains, the carriage that was the hardest to book for was a quiet carriage. So you have to turn off your mobile phones. Do you want to comment, Ellie, about getting off your phone?
Yeah, look, really good question. For each of the cities, the report has outlined a number of options in terms of entering the city from the regional area. So Brisbane actually got 4 options in the report for getting from the south of Brisbane through the Gold Coast and then into the city. Now, one of those options actually includes utilising the existing rail track, which means you do have to slow down. You don't have to transfer, but you might have to wait for commuter trains or synchronise with existing commuter trains. And that's obviously a trade-off between cost, because if you're utilising existing infrastructure, it's a lower cost, but then you're sacrificing time. And obviously the reason for a high-speed rail is you're getting between cities very, very quickly. But the other 3 options entering Brisbane actually tunnelling, and obviously the more tunnelling you do, the higher the cost, but obviously the faster the time as well. It means it's very the same, dedicated track, continue your speed, you're very, very high speed, and then you come into Roma Street station and then exit. There's also a trade-off the whole way along the route between Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. There's obviously a number of towns along the route. Not every service would stop at all towns because you want some express services, which would be dedicated to going right through city centre to city centre with no stops. But then you want some services to pick up rural traffic and regional passengers along the way too.
Stephen, just a quick question before we go. The pneumatics in the tunnel, I remember travelling on the TGV from Paris to London, and when we got into the channel, it had to slow down considerably. And then when you got out of the channel on Dover, of course, it was an old track and it had to go at 50 kilometres an hour to London. So, what about the tunnels? How do we fit the pneumatic problem?
Yeah, look, this report didn't look into that specifically. This report was focused on the technical issues of building the track and the capital costs associated with that. We look forward, though, to work by others, Institute of Engineers maybe, on doing work in that space. I don't think it's a huge barrier. It does impact, obviously, on speed in some cases. But yeah, this report didn't look into that specifically.
Lots of questions coming up. I'll start over this side and then work across here.
Thank you. I read a report a couple of weeks ago in respect of the
Graham
Porter is my name. I'm retired, 40 years land use planner with an engineering background as well. I read this report in respect of the negative impact of rail or electrical heat on tracks and the buckling issue and the safety relationship. Would maglev be a solution to that? And why are we looking at 50-year-old technology when we could be looking at the next 50 years with new technology? Is it possible? I mean, we wouldn't relate that to the safety aspect of buckling or tracks.
I certainly understand the rail buckling issue and the old joints you used to go to clickety-clacker railways that you used to sort of send you to sleep on the old wooden trains. Most modern railways across the countryside are now fully welded. The rail stress is managed to in Brisbane, for example, the neutral temperature of the rail is 38 degrees Celsius. The rail temperature can get up as high as 65 because the rail absorbs heat down to about 0. So most railways pick a 0 neutral temperature that the rail is happy at. As it heats up, the track structure and the concrete sleepers and the ballast all do every 2 feet does its bit. And that keeps it constrained. Again, managed well, buckling in rail buckling is not an issue across the countryside. It's when those buckles occur is something has gone wrong with the maintenance regime, or the standard. Again, in these railways, you just have to spend the money. You cannot nickel and dime something at this level of speed. It's like airlines, you just have to get this right, and it can be got right. On maglev, I've been on the maglev system as well. I don't understand that. I mean, this technology does exist as well, proven. I just I'll leave to others to talk about maglev.
So the shutdown of Victoria's railway 2 years ago when the temperature got over 44 degrees was a maintenance problem, not a rail.
I have walked some of the Victorian tracks. There's a maintenance issue in that work, yes.
Always a maintenance issue, right? Coming across this way, they've got to let there.
I'm Regina, I'm an economics student, and I've actually looked at both the previous government study and the high-speed rail study discussed tonight, and something that stood out to me is the extreme difference in the time frame. So the government was predicting that it would be completed by 2065, and then you're saying it's going to be completed by 2035. So to my understanding, the Sydney-Canberra corridor is going to be built first. What's actually your current predictions?
Yeah, look, really good question. If you want to start with a particular part of the route, you probably want to start with Sydney-Melbourne, given it is the busiest, fifth busiest air route in the world, and the passenger band there, as you saw from that map of Australia with the very, very thick line showing the volume of traffic travelling between Sydney and Melbourne. In terms of the time frame to complete the high-speed rail, we've seen in China recently, I think 1,300 kilometres built in 3 years, high-speed rail. Now that's China, obviously. China's a special case. In Spain, we've seen a system built, in 5 to 10 years. I don't understand why the ACOM study actually had such a long time for completion, because we've seen systems around the world being built in the order of a 10-year time frame. So we're saying a 10-year time frame is challenging but doable, and certainly we don't believe that the time frame in the previous government study was needed to be so long. Barry, did you want to?
Across, okay, yeah, just here and then back to you.
Yeah, my concern about this is what the koalas...
Name?
My name's Jan, I'm a freelance student. My concern about this project, although I think it's a great idea in general, is what the koalas and the English are going to think about it. Because their homes are going to be highly impacted depending on the choice of route, because I know environmentalists have always opposed high-speed rail in the past because it needs to have a very wide edge track because of the speed these trains go on. So what they'd be concerned about is very large slices being cut out of natural habitats where communication from one side of the track to the other for the inhabitants of those areas is pretty much out of the question unless they can fly, which some of them can. But what consideration has gone into that at this point?
There's lots of animal sort of tunnels and overpasses that you can build. They're happening around the world now that hasn't happened before. So there is consideration for it, and you can solve the problem. You can funnel animals in to go over and overpass over freeways, underneath, and so on. Stephen, did you address this?
That was going to be my response to Norway and other countries that I've been to. You have overpasses or for reindeer and moose and other things, and that would be the same for koalas and emus and the like. Obviously, environmental impacts would need to be assessed like any major infrastructure project, and that would need to be thorough, and we support obviously a thorough environmental impact, as I'm sure Larissa and the Greens would as well. Yeah, that's right. So agree, that would be an issue that would need to be addressed thoroughly. This report did not examine that issue in detail because we were focused obviously on the greenhouse gas benefits from such a system.
Larissa, would you like to add something? I know you're passionate about offsets and how offsets are not the way to go in terms of environmental offsets.
It's a great question, thanks for raising it, and I guess I would just endorse the response that Stephen's just made in that would be the province of an EIS to address, and as I said, it's about time we had decent EISs rather than many
many of them which can be underdone and not done over the appropriate time frame, and don't even look at the right time that the species is already and so forth. So you would need to address those issues. I'm hopeful that while overpasses, underpasses, various different transit methods could be used. In terms of offsets, well, look, tentative offsets are a bit of a fig leaf, and they yet to be any decent evidence to show that they can actually work, particularly when it's biodiversity offset. So I would suggest that that's probably not a good path to go down. And I had thought, and here's where I'm showing up the fact that I did only read the executive summary and not the full report, unlike some of the other distinguished speakers on the panel. I thought that you mentioned, the contents page had mentioned that you had factored in landscape topography. I'm just scanning here. So no, look, perhaps if you grab a copy of the report or have a squeeze at one of the copies lying around, we could see. But certainly that should be factored into the design selection, and if that increased the cost by a small amount, well, I think that would be a good investment to increase that cost and avoid those sensitive areas.
Just as observation, that practice of connecting of the environmental corridors and the corridors with wildlife, that's well adopted practice for an engineering project. You only have to go down to the Gold Coast. And, they're getting better and better, but certainly we need to sort of maintain that. That has a benefit from the safety perspective too. So I would see that as just a standard design element.
Just offsets, I mean, you can never replace an ecosystem completely. Mining companies will say they can, but you can't. Once that little microclimate is gone, it's gone forever. We can't rebuild it somewhere else. So we had a question up the middle here and one up there, and then I'll come over to the side.
My name's Joel, I'm a civil engineer in Brisbane. Looking at the cost per kilometre, I thought they looked like a reasonable marker on, say, heavy haul rail construction, except for the tunnels. 13 billion for 80 kilometres seemed quite low. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, look, we did look at those costs. The researchers looked at those costs in a lot of detail and looked at business, best practice. We've got costs in there of, I think, for bridge building around 150 million per kilometre. For tunnelling, average cost around 170, I think, $1 million a kilometre. They're based on industry-wide figures. The amount of tunnelling in the urban areas obviously is going to have an impact on the overall costs. But as I said before, for Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, we presented a range of options in the report for different tunnelling options, where some options were a lot more expensive because they did have more tunnelling, and other options were cheaper because they used existing trackwork or were above the ground.
One up the back there and then across this side.
Yeah, Ezra, electrical engineer student. My question is, I'm very pro high-speed rail, but since at the moment we get most of our electricity from coal and brown coal in Victoria, is it actually, if this was made tomorrow, would this be cleaner than air travel because we get our electricity from coal?
Really good question. If we were miraculously to build this in a day, and we were to use the existing electricity grid, no, it wouldn't be. It would still be less greenhouse intensive than air travel, because air travel per passenger kilometre is far more greenhouse intensive than rail. But obviously we've shown with our previous research that we can build an electricity grid in Australia based on 100% renewable energy. We can do that in 10 years. We've shown how we can do that. We've costed it. We just need the will. And therefore, we can build that, and in the same time frame we can build a high-speed rail system. So by the time we've built the stationary energy grid to be running on 100% renewable energy, we've actually got the high-speed rail system to be running on that system, which would be zero emissions overall system. So certainly, if, as I said before, if we were to somehow have a high-speed rail system tomorrow, based on our current mix of energy in Australia, it would be much more greenhouse intensive compared to a renewable energy system, but far less greenhouse gas intensive than using hydro.
Much of this also will require quite significant structural changes to our economy. I mean, you can't use this sort of fossil fuel-based economy to run all of these new zero emission sort of systems. So we will need to look very seriously at economic arrangements in the country and get off GDP as the only indicator of growth, for instance. And I'm urging the board of VZE to start thinking about research in that behavioural institutional barriers area. So moving across this way, okay.
Just asking about, I see these trains are still relatively heavy trains, and I was wondering how much speed and momentum can overcome the gradients that can eliminate a lot of tunnels and that. So how would that work?
That's one of the barriers, I think, yeah.
Certainly the report, high-speed rail is good when you get up to speed. I mean, the vertical gradients on this are quite significant. They're 2.5 to 3.5% based on worldwide practice of these sorts of engineering trains. So it's like when you're really pedaling hard, you can get up over those small hills, but the big one, at 350 kilometres an hour, those vertical gradients can be quite severe once you're up and running. The horizontal gradients are they're talking about 6, 7, 10 kilometre radius. That's dead straight for most people. So those sort of things. So that's based on engineering best practice. I understand from overseas experience in this. They tend to run around with 12 to 15 tonne axle load for trains, but the bogies are actually shared two carriages, so they're quite an advanced design and the technology of that to get it to go those sort of speeds. So it is maximising that, but there's still a limit. You can't go on 50% grade. It's not a car. You know, it has to still, when it stops, it has to stay there and still get away even in slow speed. So, from what I read of the numbers, it's what I understand of this sort of overseas experience, which I'm assuming is what you've got.
There's a lot of computer support in terms of how to manage that. I drive my Prius, keeping a close watch on that little thing with the battery charging. You go down the hill, charge the battery, fantastic. Then try and get up the next hill on electric only, it doesn't work.
Everybody can turn to page 73. 73. You got one? Look at page 73.
Psalms.
What is actually proposed here for entry to CBD and the exit from CBD north? So coming in from the south and then travelling north. What exactly are you proposing to happen? Because I think this can be horrendously expensive.
Look, rather than go through blow by blow the three different options for Sydney, South and North, I can talk to you about that afterwards, because I think it would be at least a 5-minute answer to go through the details of the Sydney options. But there are three options for South Sydney and North Sydney. Some of them use existing rail infrastructure, others have more tunnelling, so the option 3 there has a much longer tunnel from Lenfield. Option 2 has a tunnelling from Riverwood. But look, rather than, and then option 1 obviously is using existing infrastructure, that's the blue line from the south. But look, to go through each of those points one by one, I think it's probably better that I go through that with you after the question and answer session. John Krieger.
I think the important point is of the $84 billion estimate, there was about 25% to do with access into the cities.
That's right.
A high proportion of the cost is actually being in the cities. But that's your return. When you're building mass rapid transport systems all over the world, when you're in the urban set areas, you can't separate. That's your return. You need 3 things for good public transport: frequency. Yeah. You get that for separation.
That's right.
Tunnels.
Coming from the south and going north.
That's right. Using existing infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to keep going up this way, and Jeff, you're going to be the last one. Okay.
Association for the Study of Peak Oil. Given that we're running at very close headways for the speed, and that we are combining express services with more localized services, how much proportion of massive tracks do you have to provide?
Yeah, well, Barry.
Plays half that, I think. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but these trains take a long, and a little bit I've read of the report. For the stations you're looking to stop at, they mostly allow alternate sidings to come off through a very, 1 in 25, 1 in 35 turnout. Probably 5 kilometres or so to slow down, and then as you come out of the station, it's like passing, they're long passes, 5, 6 seconds to get up to speed so you then merge it at the full line speed. And what I've seen in most of the designs, apart from those tight areas, I think like Gold Coast, where the cost is so much, they've slowed down anyway, so they've just stopped. Hence why you stop at Gold Coast, stop at all. That's what I read out of the report. So, but again, that's existing practice. You go from Lyon to Paris, transit pass while you're standing there at Lyon. Meantime, you've taken a long time to get up 5-6k, and then you merge at the right speed, and that keeps you. It's like merging at a freeway, 100k. You merge easily, supposed to go slow.
Yeah.
That makes, I assume that's all being designed.
That's right, and you see that already in Australia. I travel by train as much as I can, believe it or not. I'm going to do a spruik for New South Wales Trains. They've got a rail pass for $430 for 6 months, unlimited rail travel between Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, Canberra. And they've actually got a premium pass, because when I went and bought my pass, I said, have you thought about a first class pass for one of these? And it's $550 now for unlimited travel by train for 6 months. So I travel by train a lot. I didn't travel by train here tonight. But when I do travel by train, it exactly happens now with rail freight and passengers. So you often see the rail trains coming through, and they know there's a passenger train behind them. They pull off to one side, and then the passenger train comes through and then just continues ahead. You see it in Frankfurt, you see it in Europe all the time with the express trains just whizzing through, slowing down slightly for the city stops, while the other ones are slowing down, picking up traffic along the way. So yeah, that's all being accounted for in the report. So yeah, happy to talk about that more.
Stephen will be here for as long as we need him. We're running 5 minutes over the allotted time to finish, but I'm going to keep going with the questions up there.
Ed Parker. Just sort of on that same theme of the urban connection, I notice in the timetable, 23 minutes from the Gold Coast to Brisbane, obviously is dependent on an exclusive alignment. But does that, 23 minutes would be a great incentive for commuter traffic from Gold Coast to Brisbane. Is it the intention to pick up some of that, or in fact not? Because you end up filling up the Gold Coast to Brisbane, you're not going to have enough seats for the people to get from Sydney to Brisbane, for example. So are you going to allow for local commuter traffic, or not?
Yeah, no, I understand the question. Thanks, good and very good question. And look, there's always trade-offs, right? So as we've heard tonight, to have a safe, the first question was on safety. To have a safe system, you need to have a dedicated rail. So as soon as you start sharing a high-speed rail track with commuter traffic, with commuter trains, then you compromise safety. The system we've outlined in this report is for 2 stops in the Gold Coast, one in Nerang, one in Brisbane, and they would be dedicated to high-speed rail. So we'd pick up traffic there. So people who live near those areas would be able to drive their car, park at that station or get a bus at that station, and then be on that dedicated high-speed rail service into the city, into Brisbane City.
But does that mean that they could end up using up all of the available seats, and then it'd be more of a problem?
That's right.
That's right. And again, as I said before, not every train will be stopping in Nerang or Brisbane. So there'll be express services, and you'd be sharing that demand across the schedule, and you change the schedule to meet the demand.
Also, from a public transport system, you can actually manage it. In other words, you want to test this train to pre-book. So you manage the month. So at the moment, the QR system, you just turn up with a transit card you can get on, and it's just where it fills up first. As this type of system actually separated and say, look, you have free, so it can be managed.
I'm going to allow two more questions. There was one somewhere up here before Jeff. Yeah.
Mine's finished.
Okay, Jeff, last question.
Just a quick follow-up to Georgina's question about the staging. My question is about return on investment. It appears to me that you spend all of your money first and then start the earning of revenue after you've finished. Have you thought about staging, say, Sydney to Canberra first so that you can get that revenue going early in the piece?
Yeah, certainly. And as I mentioned before, Sydney, Melbourne would be the obvious sector to start with. Very, very high demand. You're going to get quick returns. You're going to get good uptake. You're going to get good revenues to pay off the investment. Sydney, Melbourne, I think it was 40 billion of investment in terms of capital. Similar costs, for Sydney, Brisbane, but not the same volume. So our recommendation would be to start, if you're going to start on a staged approach, with Sydney, Melbourne, where you get the highest volume.
I didn't notice that in the graphs.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Is Andrew King still with us? Yeah. Andrew. Yeah. Andrew King is the author of this wonderful book, Angie Bear's Dream, that I mentioned earlier. And I'm giving each of our panellists a copy of Angie Bear's Dream, personally signed by the author, Andrew King, up the back. Would you please join me yet again in thanking our fantastic panelists. Okay, it's now up to all of you to really get behind this and drive it. Talk to your neighbours over the barbecue, tell them about this. We can do it, but we need to mobilise it, we need to socialise it, we need to get people talking about it so that the politicians really have no other option but to start facilitating its implementation. Now, would you please join us? If anyone has picked up a report, they are for sale, they're not free. So if you picked one up thinking they were free, would you please pay for them outside or give them back to the volunteers? And we're now opening up for drinkies and nibbles outside here. And as we put money into this, our volunteers, would you please tip a little bit in the tin to help pay for it? Thank you all very much for coming along. Once again, let's thank our panellists.